I'm going to begin. I want to welcome all of you to a new series that we're beginning today, Conversations from the Edge. It'll feature new authors or new works authored by friends and scholars in conversations over the next few months. We'll try to do one a month. And I just want to make it clear that there will be a link posted, or if not already, for the book written by David Myers and Nomi Stolzenberg, American Shtetl, available, I think, with a discount from Princeton University Press. We're trying to push it up the Amazon ladder. Let's see how you can help. How you can help in the effort. I also want to mention that these conversations are part of an educational institute that many of you helped to fund at Hillel. We hope that the efforts continue and that they continue with your support. So if it's possible for you to consider a gift to Hillel, it would be most appreciated, as it is at all times. Hillel is serving a very significant role during this period of the pandemic as an outpost, actually, for students who've been able to find the remnants of community during these very difficult times. The next event, or the next conversation, is scheduled for Thursday, March the 10th. I'm sorry for the different date. There are reasons of circumstances, and it's also scheduled for 11 o'clock in the morning. Our speaker, our conversationist, I guess, is in Israel. It's Arthur Green, Rabbi Art Green, and the title of the presentation or the conversation is Reflections on God, Life and Love, Spiritual Wisdom for Troubled Times. That's Thursday, March 10th at 11 a.m. So please mark it down, and obviously there will be a notice is sent to you all. Future events and conversations will feature hopefully Deborah Lipstadt and among others, and Lady Cotton Pogrebin, who both of whom have committed, as well as some others. We'll let you know as soon as we have the calendar, as soon as those events are scheduled. And now we have the pleasure of beginning our series with a conversation with two of my dear friends, David Myers and Nomi Stolzenberg. I'll begin by saying a few words about Nomi. Nomi, as you know, is the Nathan and Lily Chappelle's chair at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. She is a legal scholar whose research spans a range of interdisciplinary interests: law and religion, law and liberalism, law and feminism, law and psychoanalysis, and law and literature. At USC, she helped to establish the Center for Law, History, and Culture, one of the preeminent centers for the study of law and the humanities, which she currently co-directs. Among her projects, which actually touches upon the subject today, is faith-based discrimination. She's working on a new theory of faith-based discrimination, and these issues are not just theoretical in terms of how they're reflected in their analysis of the Satmar community, but they actually have some significance, some important significance to contemporary American life. I hope that we can get to that during our conversation. David Myers is my study partner and my very, very dear friend. He's a leading contemporary Jewish historian and historiographer. We might say a public intellectual, one of a dying breed, who is the Stady and Ludwig Kahn Professor of Jewish History at UCLA, where he also serves as the director of the Luskin Center for History and Policy. I always like to emphasize, I think, and it goes for both Nomi and David in terms of their home and their life, that they're not only academics and intellectuals, but they've opened their home to the community. And the active participants in translating the principles that they abide by into reality. That's also significant, because we don't see too much of that today. David is the author of 15 books. Among them, I'll mention a few of them. I'm sure you'll all go out and buy them right away. Reinventing the Jewish Past, European Jewish Intellectuals and the Zionist Return to History, Between Jew and Arab, The Lost Voice of Simon Rabidovich, and The Stakes of History, as a historiographer, he writes, on the use and abuse of Jewish history for life. Thank you, Nomi and David, for joining us. We will begin with this great adventure into Kiryas Joel. Excuse me for not using the Sephardic pronunciation. It would, I think, be inappropriate when discussing Satmar to speak with an Israeli accent. And that will become clear in some of you in the discussion. To introduce the subject, I just want to say that I felt that, this is not the greatest sort of critical evaluation. It was a great book. It drew me in. The book itself, which is technical and historical, legal, preserves a sense of drama and intrigue. And there are dimensions in the unfolding of the story that read like an adventure story. I have to ask forgiveness for saying that, I was thinking about, as I was reading this book, I was thinking about The Godfather. There's no killing in the book, all right? But, but there's something that grabbed me about this group and its power and the power of the founding rabbi, the central figure in the establishment of the Satmar dynasty, such as it is. The book reflects a sense of admiration for a great American achievement, but paradoxically, it festered within me some increased greater resentment towards this community. I grew up in Brooklyn just as the Satmar were flourishing, and the community, the Hungarian Jewish community, was exerting new influence, which hopefully we'll touch upon in our conversation. So let's begin.
Right. Hi, welcome. Thank you, Chaim.
Thank you for such a lovely introduction.
You're welcome. All right, it's from the heart. All right. So, Dave, tell us, who are the Satmar? Where are they from, and when did they get here? And as you move through this question is, what is Kiryas Joel? This creation, this amalgam called Kiryas Joel. Why was it established, and how is it governed? Please.
Okay, that's about 6 questions, Chaim, in typical fashion.
Yeah, but you told me I would never get through all of them, so I have to.
That's how. If we take them in batches of 6, we'll get through them. What can I say, Chaim? It's good to be in conversation with you. I say that because we're in conversation virtually every day, but we have not been in conversation about the book yet. So let me begin at the beginning by saying thank you to Chaim and Giselle and allowing us to inaugurate this series of conversations on the edge. At some level, this is an edgy topic, and Chaim alluded to sort of some of the underlying controversy that has accompanied the Satmar Hasidic group throughout its history. Who are the Satmar Hasidim? Well, first of all, they are the largest Hasidic group in the world today, probably by an order of magnitude of 2, twice as large as the Lubavitch Chabad Hasidic group. But unlike Chabad, they did not expand or grow by virtue of outreach, but rather through internal growth, through a very high birth rate, and through an intense commitment to preserving the bounds of the community, but also to expanding it in a kind of imperial fashion through a mix of birth rate and utilization of the instrumentalities of the state to allow for the flourishing of the community. We'll get into that. Where do they come from? Well, they come from the northeast quadrant of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The founder of the Satmar Hasidic dynasty was a man by the name of Joel or Joel Teitelbaum, known as Rabbi Chaim, born in 1887 in Sighet, which was one of the most important cities in Hungarian Jewry in what is known as the Unterland region, which was one of the most important incubators of what we know today of as Haredi Judaism. That is to say, ultra-Orthodox or stringently observant Judaism. The Teitelbaum family played an important role in the development of Haredi Judaism in the Hungarian incubator in the northeast quadrant of Hungary. What's interesting to note is that the Satmar group, which has become the largest in the world, is for Hasidic dynasties a modern invention. It was really only in 1934 that we have the establishment of a rabbi in a town, a city called Satmar, or after 1920, Satumare, who was able to congregate followers around him and begin to build a dynasty of his own. That was Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum when he was appointed chief rabbi of the city of Satumare. He had served a number of congregations in Hungary before, and other parts of that region that after 1920, after the Treaty of Trianon, had been sliced up into different domains: Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, Romania. Joel Teitelbaum circulates around this area, serves as rabbi in various settings, and in 1934 settles in what had been known in Hungarian as Satmar and in Romanian Satumare. And there he begins to build up his flock of disciples, but has only 10 years to do so, because in March 1944, the Nazi German forces invade Hungary, and within a matter of 3 or 4 months, deport 3/4 of the community to concentration and death camps, including about 3/4 of the population of Satumare and the surrounding county. Joel Teitelbaum, for reasons that we can explore, manages to survive, not in the most luxurious accommodations by any stretch of the imagination. He spends about 6 months in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp before he's liberated to Switzerland. He then, ironically enough, for reasons we can explore, spends about a year in Jerusalem in 1945-46, and then makes his way to the United States, ostensibly to raise funds for his orphanage back in Jerusalem. Arrives on the second day of Rosh Hashanah 1946, and after he alights from the ship, settles in Williamsburg and Brooklyn, and quickly sets about to bring together the tattered fragments of Holocaust survivors, a substantial number of Hungarians among them, in Brooklyn, who had survived the war and made their way to the United States. And there he begins to build up the American branch of the Satmar Hasidic group. Very early on in his American tenure, Rabbi Teitelbaum understands that while Brooklyn and Williamsburg in particular have many assets that can aid in the development of a stringently religious community, it was also essential to seek out a place outside of the city, away from the seductions and allures of the city, where members of his community could dwell in a state of spiritual purity, that being the ultimate goal. And in fact, Joel Teitelbaum, it's important to note, like his forebears, was obsessed with the idea that the world, especially the modern world, was beset by spiritual pollution. The world around him was a world of pollution, of contamination. And therefore it was all the more important to create a spiritual enclave outside of the city, but close enough to it to allow for daily commuting for reasons of economic livelihood. This is a community, by the way, in which the men do not learn all day. Joel Teitelbaum insisted that men work. They learn in the morning, they learn in the evening, but they should go to work, and increasing numbers of women also work within the community. The search for that spiritual enclave took dozens of years, took about a little less than 3 decades. The lieutenants to whom Joel Teitelbaum entrusted this task first sought to find land on Staten Island, then in New Jersey, and when the plan became public that a group of Hasidim sought to purchase hundreds of acres of land, the town residents as well as officials decided they weren't interested in having this an invasion of these foreign Jews. And that became part of the challenge in creating the enclave that Joel Teitelbaum wanted, which is to say, when Satmar Hasidim came to purchase land, there were very few willing sellers. So that over the course of time, the Satmars became wise. Now we move ahead into the late 1960s, early 1970s. And the chief aide to Joel Teitelbaum, a man by the name of Leibish Lefkowitz, who became the first mayor of Kiryas Joel, called upon his brother-in-law, who was a non-observant Hungarian Jew, married to his wife, Dina. And that person, a man by the name of Oscar Fisher, became the front man for the purchase of land in the surrounding county outside of New York City, in Orange County, New York, in the town of Monroe. There in 1972, the first purchase of land was made, and almost immediately thereafter, apartments and single-family homes began to be built, a process that took about 2 years. And in the summer of 1974, so this is some almost 30 years after Joel Teitelbaum arrives in the United States, the first Satmar settlers make their way from Brooklyn to this neighborhood of the town of Monroe. I'll say one more thing, and then feel free to jump in, Nomi or Chaim. And that is that when the Satmar Hasidim moved to Monroe, they moved to 80 garden apartments and 25 single-family homes. It's fair to say that they had a very different understanding of what residential housing meant than the residents and town officials of Monroe, who sort of imagined their community as a suburban ideal. Which is to say that Satmars thought it was perfectly legitimate to have a mikveh or a matzah bakery or a nursery school in the basement of the apartment, which did not conform to the zoning regulations of the town of Monroe. As a result of the zoning conflicts between the Satmar residents of Kiryas Joel, the Satmar residents of Monroe and Monroe town officials, there was a very significant escalation in hostilities with threats of litigation in both state and federal courts. And at perhaps the point of greatest tension, a compromise was reached, which granted the Satmars the right to carve out a village within the town of Monroe, which would have the right to set in place its own zoning regulations. Still part of the town of Monroe, but able to have its own degree of autonomy, and indeed legally recognized by the state of New York as its own municipality with the right to elect its officials and significantly regulate its own zoning. That development occurs in late fall 1976, and then in March 1977, then Secretary of State Mario Cuomo signs the official letter of incorporation, and Kiryas Joel, the village of Joel, named after Joel Teitelbaum, takes rise. I'll write all about it.
Thank you. I did want to ask if you can be brief on this point, but I'd like to ask you this before we go on, and I turn to Nomi, and that is, how did you get in, David? I mean, this is not a community that sort of is open to everyone. It's an exclusive community. You're a real stranger. In fact, you're from that hostile side. So what magic did you were you able somehow?
Yeah. Well, right, you just used the term exclusive. So first of all, I want to note a connection between this question and your first question, right? So if I can just, before I directly answer the question you just posed, just to add some context to the story David told, because our book is simultaneously a story about the Satmars who founded and live in Kiryas Joel, and it's also a story about America. So everything that David just related, I think everyone here already knows what the background to this is. This is happening in the era of suburbanization, right? In the era in which many Americans are leaving the cities for the suburbs. And of course, that is, in that period of time, very much a story about white flight, and the creation of oftentimes newly developed suburban communities, or pre-existing ones are growing. And as David alluded to, the use of zoning regulations, zoning ordinances, becomes a tool of exclusion. So I just want to, this issue of exclusion and exclusivity. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about the Satmar community, if you sort of try to fit them into that broader American narrative of suburbanization and white flight and the use of exclusionary zoning on the part of suburbs to keep out less affluent, disproportionately Black and brown people, the Satmars occupy this really ambiguous position. Are they, you just call them exclusive or are they the excluders or are they the excluded? And what's so interesting is they're both, and they really confound that distinction. So, David relates how there were repeated attempts to buy property in Staten Island, in New Jersey, and even in Monroe, and they are very much in the position of the excluded, right? They aren't able to do this for many years. And even once they're able to buy property and develop it and begin to settle in Monroe, they continue to be the victims of classic exclusionary zoning. But from another point of view, they are participants in white flight, and they enjoy some of the benefits of that, both their perceived whiteness, and you need money, you need capital to be able to be not the excluded, but the people who are going to become the excluders. And that's very interesting because per capita, this is one of the poorest communities in America, but for reasons we can explain later, they are nonetheless. So that's very interesting, their ambiguous position. Okay, so are they exclusionary? Are they excluders? Or are they excluded? Both. You raised the question, so how do we get access to the community? Insofar as one of the modalities we used of our research was interviews, really talking to people and kind of field work. So in a moment, David, I hardly did go into the community. I did do interviews with a lot of people who live outside the community, interface with it in important ways. But I do want to preface before David answers the question more fully, why I didn't. We knew going into it that there were going to be certain skews in terms of, there are always biases. First of all, there's questions of representativeness, and are there built-in biases to this kind of ethnographic fieldwork? And one of the most obvious ones, of course, is inevitably there's going to be a gender bias, because the most accessible part of the community is the public side of the community, which is, with some interesting exceptions, male. And there are very traditional gender norms and norms of gender segregation. So we knew that, first of all, I would have less access in terms of doing that kind of field work. And even if people were going to speak to me, by which I mean men, who were the most likely to be speaking to outsiders, they would probably speak to me in a different way and maybe less forthcoming way. Now, there is an antidote to that, a methodological antidote. If I were an anthropologist or a sociologist, which I'm not, I think a woman, and in another life, I would have loved to do this. You could do the kind of embedded long-term participant observation, get to know women as well as men, but there were many reasons I could not do that. Lack of training. I live in Los Angeles. I have a lot of other things to do. So that wasn't in the cards. So I did not do that kind of research, but David did. And he can tell you how he got access.
Right. So I just should say a brief word about how I got to the project, Nomi has been consistently interested in the way in which religious subcommunities operate on the political and legal landscape of the United States. She's been interested in a wide range of such communities. Some are evangelical Christians, self-defined fundamentalists. One very interesting community was a group of followers of an Indian guru in a place that became incorporated as a city called Rajneeshpuram in Oregon around the same time as Kiryas Joel. And one was a group of Satmar Hasidim in this community called Kiryas Joel. So I, a Jewish historian, would look over the shoulder of my wife to see what she was looking at, and just found this ceaselessly fascinating because it really seemed to be a community almost without precedent in modern Jewish history in the diaspora. That is to say, not just a strong form of community that was able to resist the forces of sort of the nefarious forces of modernity, ranging from totalitarian fascism to liberal assimilationism, but it was even recognized as a legal municipality. So at a certain point, I just said, I have to join in here. And I wrote a letter to the community and said, would it be okay if I came to study it? And I got a response from the person who at the time was sort of the chief outward-facing point of contact, the first superintendent of the public school created within Kiryas Joel, a man by the name of Stephen Bernardo. And to my great surprise, Stephen Bernardo said, yes, please come. And when I got there, I was told Kiryas Joel at this point, after 25 or 30 years of existence, was actually interested in having someone hold up a mirror so that it could take a look at itself and see how it appeared, especially within the context of the United States of America. And that was already just the first instance in which I understood that there was something surprisingly, almost shockingly American about the community, about the language in which it described even my arrival. And I began to engage in conversations with people in the community, principally those associated with the establishment faction, which we'll have a chance, I hope, to describe. But then over the course of time, I made my way not just to the establishment, but to the various opponents of the establishment, based on the very simple premise that people would ask me, well, whom did you last speak to? And if I said I spoke to the mainstream and they were the opponents, the dissidents, they would say, all right, come on over. I got to explain to you the real, the real way it went down. So we actually benefited in some sense from the existence of very fractious rifts within the community. And I had, pretty wide-ranging access, principally, but not exclusively, to men. Some of the most fascinating conversations I had were with women, which we talk about in the book. I continue to go back to this day. So I would just say one other thing, Chaim, that this required a bit of retooling on my part, because I'm an intellectual historian who studies the ideas of principally dead people. And this project required really some of the skills, or at least the insights, of ethnographers who live amongst decidedly living subjects. And that was a whole new enterprise for me to undertake, and really was the most fascinating research project of my life.
Aside from the fact that the two of you worked on this together, I mean, I think that's also remarkable.
Yes.
I mean, I if we had enough time, I'd love to explore. I think it would be very important for our listeners. How does an academic couple from two different disciplines come together to produce a work of scholarship? And that to me is fascinating and a real mark of achievement on the part of you that I think that we need to recognize. So
I just have to say, it wasn't always easy, because we have different working styles and rhythms of work, but it was extraordinary. I mean, this is not just the person to whom I married, it's my best friend, my conversation partner, with whom I share, so much in so many ways, including my professional and her professional lives. I just want to convey this to actually complete this in the way that we did is, for us, just incredible source of joy, and an amazing, personal and familial achievement, which we feel very palpably.
If I can just add, this Sunday will be the 40th anniversary of the day we met. And the day we met, or the evening we met, in the company of two dear friends of mine, we started talking and didn't stop talking for hours. And I am sure that if we could go back and like listen in on that conversation of 40 years ago, I'm sure in some sense we were talking about these themes of Jewish identity in the modern world. And I think we've been talking about these issues for the last 40 years since we met. And it's something we share on a very deep level, despite going into different
And
disciplines.
it wasn't always clear that marrying, as it were, our disciplinary and methodological interests would work. And at various points, along the ride, we were like, does this really blend and fit? And at least to our assessment, it does. Sort of combining Nomi's incredible unpacking of this thicket of legal actions and decisions involving the Satmar Hasidim of Kiryas Joel and Williamsburg, and my sort of more long-term historical perspective. We tried to sort of bring these dual lenses to the story. The readers will ultimately decide, but we think we brought some new insight to this community.
And you did, and I think that your achievement is a real testament to your relationship. So thank you for that and sharing. I also have another side comment, which is when you mentioned before in the first exchange something that you termed zoning regulations. So I thought to myself, Satmar Hasidim, what's a zoning regulation? What's a regulation? Regulations are there for us to be able to do what we want to do, not what they tell us to do. So perhaps I'm a little bit too cynical, but we'll get to that. I think we'll get to that. Now, Nomi, tell us a little bit about how are the Satmar different from the Amish, and why is their story special and important, socially, politically, and most important, legally? What's its significance for church-state relations? I don't know. We don't have many hours, but this is of course what's weighing on us. This is a religious community that's incorporated. The law of the community, is it American law or is it Jewish law? What about the intersection of those interests? Who governs? Is the rabbi the government of Satmar? Is there something in Satmar that you could call secular? What's secular in Satmar? Right. Everything is religious.
Right.
So give us a few hours and we'll solve these problems.
So I remember, I haven't heard this phrase in a long time, but I don't know, in the 80s or 90s, some Hollywood movie came out about a Hasidic community, and everyone was like, they were described as the Jewish Amish. There's a reason why everyone goes there, and everyone says, well, how are they different from the Amish? It's because in certain ways, they are like the Amish. And I think part of the reason we go to the Amish, because in point of fact, in American history and in contemporary America, the Amish, American history is filled with examples of small, sectarian, religious, separatist communities. The Mennonites, the Amish, they're just one. We could talk about the Shakers or the Oneidas or this ones or that ones. I think the Amish were very prominent in the American popular imagination at that point in time, in part because there was a very prominent Supreme Court case in the early 70s that brought the Amish to wide attention. And certainly from a legal point of view, it makes the comparison almost irresistible. That was a case in which the Amish had gone to court saying that they had a right under the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. The First Amendment guarantees the free exercise of religion, to be exempt from compulsory education laws, right? Every state has laws that make it compulsory to send your children to school. They didn't actually object to doing that through 8th grade, but after 8th grade, enough, you got to keep them down on the farm. And in a very interesting, in hindsight, very anomalous decision, the Supreme Court recognized their claim and said they have a right to not follow that law. And in doing so, the Supreme Court recognized and valorized, attached a very high value to their separatism, to religious separatism, and interpreted the principle of the free exercise of religion, of religious liberty, as protecting the right of this kind of religious separatist community to exist. And so similarities, right? Like the Satmars, or the Satmars like the Amish, English is not their primary language, right? They, dress, especially the men, dress the same way their forebears dressed. The women dress, according to traditional norms of modesty, covered. And above all, as you said, these are both communities that are dedicated to withdrawing from society, insulating themselves from exposure to the outside society so that they can live in accord with religious law, which then raises all the questions you ask, like, well, what is the law within these communities? The big difference is that the Amish community, they start the same way. In each case, the communities acquire private property and they settle on land that they have purchased. There's no government action. This is all what we call communitarianism from the bottom up. You use and there's an irony here, right? The sort of quintessentially liberal individualistic rights of private property and freedom of contract turn out to be the building blocks of all of these communitarian societies. The Satmars did the same thing, but then the Satmars took the next step of transforming a private enclave into an officially recognized public legal municipality. The Amish haven't done that.
Yeah, and just to sort of put a fine point on that, the Amish in the famous Wisconsin v. Yoder case from 1972 to opt out of sort of the public sphere, sought to sort of remove themselves from control of the government. Satmar Hasidim seek to use the instrumentalities of government in order to promote, in a certain sense, that same ideal, but through a different way. The ideal being the preservation of a social and spiritual enclave. So they're two very different legal strategies and politics that inform the two communities.
Mm-hmm. And it actually really suggests that there are three different models of religious separatist communities. The great, great legal scholar Robert Cover, who was the first professor of American law in the 1980s to kind of really create an encounter between the study of American law and Jewish law, he drew a distinction, very much with the Amish in mind, between what he called insular communities and redemptive communities, where insular, in keeping with the way David, so the Amish would be the insular, they're just asking to be allowed to opt out. And then Cover contrasted that to what he called redemptive communities that seek to project their vision of religious and spiritual purity onto the entire society. The Satmars are neither. I mean, they are insular, and yet they're doing more than just asking to opt out. This is really this third option that we call accommodationist, that they, in this somewhat contradictory, paradoxical way, engage with the outside world in some pretty, I don't know if the right word is assertive ways, but for the sake of enabling the community to be separate.
Right. So I would say that what you described are a group of people who have learned how to master the system. They come from the outside rather than merely isolate themselves completely and say, we don't want a part of that world. Their question is, how can we use that world for our benefit? Well, we might come back. I just want to tell our listeners, there's a lot to discuss. I mean, we're just able to scratch the surface today. And it's such a rich conversation that has to do both with the development of Judaism in America and of American law. So it's really striking from that perspective. And on your point, Nomi, about you shied away from using the term aggressive. You're a good scholar. I would agree with aggressive. I mean, they're pushy in the way in which, I mean, just to be colloquial, in the way in which maybe the Amish are not. You might even say sometimes in your face with their demands and their development and their growth. All right, David, I'd like to spend a little bit of time. People should know something about the personality of this founding rabbi, Rabbi Yolish. And there we know that we have someone who was contentious in his life, who was fierce. He was stringent in his own observance. He was abstemious and fasted often and really pursued, as you said, purification, in both personally and purification for his community. But his writing is often venomous, hostile to others, to other Jews, to Gentiles. Well, he speaks about Gentiles. And as I was reading and refamiliarizing myself with the Satmar, and I said earlier that I grew up in Borough Park, and although we weren't exactly Williamsburg, there was an overflow that eventually came to Borough Park of Satmar Hasidim, and there was a development of a Hungarian community that leads me to the following questions. Number one, what was it about the Hungarian Unterland that produced religious extremism? Because Rabbi Yolish, the Satmar were not the only ones. The Munkachers were extremists. There was and they sort of drew from another part of the Orthodox world, from the Chatam Sofer, Sam Sofer from Presburg, which was a yeshivish type of ultra-Orthodoxy. What was it about that domain? Number one. Number two, is it possible that this fierce personality, the character of Rabbi Teitelbaum, the founder, actually shaped the community itself and produced a fierce and confrontational, strife-ridden community that not only battled for their rights with the outside world, but was constantly battling internally? If we can maybe get to that, even touch that later on. Other thing, I do want to get to one very important point. What was Rabbi Yolish's teachings regarding the state of Israel? Briefly, because that I think is, and its relationship to the Holocaust, rather important. And just to simply reflect on a question that was asked in the chat that I saw, yes, indeed, Rabbi Teitelbaum was saved by on the Kastner train. David knows a lot more about this, but that raises this whole issue. Here was a vitriolic opponent of Zionism who paradoxically or ironically, was saved by the leading Zionist in Hungary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there are a few questions there, Chaim. So let me begin at the beginning. The Hungarian Unterland, where, as you noted, we have two of the most stringent of the Haredi groups that emerge in this period in the 19th century. The Teitelbaum family that gave rise to Rabbi Yolish, the Munkacher Hasidim, but we also have Tzantz and Pupa and really a good number of others. The Hungarian Unterland was why was it the incubator or laboratory for Haredi Judaism? It was really at the crossroads of competing currents of Jewish and general culture, sort of Enlightenment forces moving from the West and sort of anti-Enlightenment traditionalist forces coming from the east and the north. And in a certain sense, the Unterland was the battleground between those competing vectors, and became this place of enormous experimentation, not just, by the way, in terms of Haredi Judaism, but other forms of Jewish denominational affiliation, like the distinctly Hungarian neolog or the status quo community, which emerged in the Unterland as well as in parts further west in Hungary. There was something about Hungary as this meeting point of East and West that made it a fascinating site of the formation of new, decidedly modern forms of Judaism, including Haredi Judaism, an unmistakably modern invention, notwithstanding the desire and intent of Haredim to sort of suggest that their origins lie in antiquity. They, particularly Satmar, holds to the sort of the credo that we follow in Derech Yisrael Sava, the path of the ancient Israel. And yet Satmar and Haredi Judaism is very much a modern invention. It's in that laboratory of, that intense laboratory of religious confrontation that manifested itself in outright conflicts between liberal and non-liberal forms of orthodoxy from 1865 to 1870, which actually required the intervention of the Hungarian government, that the Teitelbaum family really emerged as a significant force. It should be noted that the progenitor of the Teitelbaum line, Reb Moshe Teitelbaum, known as the Yismach Moshe, joined forces with the aforementioned Chassam Sofer to forge a common front against modernizing currents within Judaism, which, by the way, could mean everything from the first efforts at reform to the attempt to synthesize orthodoxy and more modern secular currents. Mm-hmm. Both were deemed as kind of sources of threat to the Teitelbaum family.
Even using the vernacular.
Even using the vernacular. That's right. Even using the vernacular, going to non-Jewish schools. Very typically, Reb Yulish himself would come into a town where he was the newly appointed rabbi and demand, a complete revision of the behavior of the Jewish community. Close down butcher shops and bakeries for not being sufficiently kosher. There was in him, at one and the same time, a kind of extraordinarily powerful charismatic piety that you still hear reflections of to this day amongst his followers. And he's been dead for over 40 years. He died in August 1979. What they say is the very gaze of Reb Yoelish sort of chiseled out a permanent image on the face of those whom he looked at. You hear that in account after account, as if it was, it sounds like a true and real spiritual experience that owed to the extraordinary charisma of Reb Yoelish, who was, as you noted, abstemious, ascetic, obsessed with hygiene. One colleague of ours claims he was possessed or had a kind of version of OCD in his preparations for his ablutions and preparation for prayer. But what is important to note, alongside that charismatic piety and alongside his very considerable erudition, was that Teitelbaum gene for combat. And where did that come from? I'm not sure we can trace its biological origins, but we can its sociological and historical. It was rooted in the sense that modernity is life lived in extremis. The threat of modernity is all surrounding and requires constant vigilance and battle. And as it emerged in the 20th century, as the Teitelbaum dynasty makes its way into the 20th century, in the person of Reb Yoelish, the chief source of threat to the integrity of Torah true Judaism was not the assimilation of the modernizers and not the threats of the outside Gentile world, but Zionism.
And if I can just interject before David elaborates on the very important issue of Zionism. So, I mean, that is a paradox of religious separatism that I think besets every religious separatist community. Because on the one hand, religious separatism is driven by a theology, a political theology, or sort of anti-political theology of quietism, right? They subscribe to the doctrine of political quietism. What we want to do is withdraw from worldly affairs, from political and economic and any material activity. We want to withdraw from the realm of the exercise of power. But in order to do that, we need to combat the forces that prevent us from doing that. And that turns out to involve engaging with and maybe exercising some of the very powers that they purport to renounce.
Right. So Satmar and the Teitelbaums adopted an attitude of quietism, subservience to the state, consistent with the ancient principle of dina di machuta dina, the law of the kingdom is the law, and simultaneously an attitude of combativeness and confrontation towards threats, especially emanating from the Jewish world. Those were battles that had to be fought. Zionism, in its impulse to hasten the messianic end through the process of dichikat haketz, arrogated to itself a function that could only be held by God, and therefore posed a grave threat to the Jewish world in the eyes of Rabbi Yoelish, who devoted a very good portion of his writing, most famously his tome Vayol Moshe from 1950-1960, which Chaim is showing us right here. But even before that, in the early years of his rabbinate, even before he became the chief rabbi of Satmar, he joined forces with the Munkacher Rebbe to fight against any attempts at organization of the Zionist movement in their realm. Already then he sensed that this was the gravest threat, or as he described it in Vayol Moshe, the chief form of spiritual pollution in the world. And indeed, in one of the most controversial theological stances that he adopted, came to understand the Holocaust as divine retribution for this attempt to push the hand of God in the form of Zionism. I just want to say one more thing about a source of controversy around Rabbi Yoelish that you alluded to. As I mentioned, on March 19th, 1944, German forces invaded Hungary, breaking the arrangement that had existed between Hitler and Admiral Horthy, the leader of Hungary, and very quickly began a process of deportation of the Jews of Hungary to concentration and extermination camps. Rabbi Yoelish was one of 1,685 people saved by a Hungarian Zionist official by the name of Rudolf Kastner. Because of his connections and funds that exchanged hands, he was included on this train, this transport, that was supposed to take its travelers to freedom, but ended up making its way to Bergen-Belsen, where the Kastner transport people were kept apart from other Jews incarcerated. This, by the way, was the result of negotiations that Kastner undertook with none other than Adolf Eichmann, and made Rudolf Kastner one of the most controversial figures in the state of Israel, to which he moved after the Holocaust. In fact, in a famous instance, Kastner actually went to court to battle we thought was a libelous accusation made against him, namely that he was a conspirator with the Nazis. And Rabbi Yoelish, who was saved by Kastner, was asked if he would testify as a character witness for Kastner. And Yoelish said, it wasn't Kastner who saved me, it was God. And that brought an end to any further discussion of his showing up. What I think this reflects in sort of the most extreme form is a tradition that we try to excavate, already extending back to Hungary, but certainly continuing to the United States, which is the accommodation of Satmar to political exigencies and realities. And so in a certain sense, linking the quietism and the combativeness, enabling both, is this pattern of accommodation with Gentile or secular authorities. In the book, you will see one of the most famous pictorial representations of that, which is when Rabbi Yoelish greeted the Romanian king, King Carol, in 1936, adopting a kind of somewhat subservient position toward him. This commitment to accommodation to Gentile hosts went alongside of the quietism and the combativeness and also enabled it. When it was transported to the United States, that accommodationism really became a kind of high art form in the hands of Satmar practitioners, who, I should say, Chaim, were on American soil playing the game of American interest group politics. Like,
Yes.
we might say, like, how could this be? This is such a violation of all norms of ethical behavior. They were playing the game of American interest group politics, and they did it very well.
Yes. So it led me actually to conclude that the fulfillment of the rabbinic, the historically important and significant rabbinic rule, Talmudic rule of Shmuel, Dina de Malchuta Dina, that the law of the land is the law, actually was reflected and manifest in Satmar by pushing the politics of self-interest. What higher law is there in America than group self-interest, unfortunately? So that really is exemplifies a degree of their Americanism. I don't know whether you agree with it. I mean, it's kind of, I see that they were exploiters of American law. And in doing so, the question that I have in the back of my mind is, how much damage did they cause to the structures of American law? I mean, a small group, but what does it symbolize in terms of what we're looking for, what we're looking at in terms of the future? I also want to add the following, that Rabbi Teitelbaum told his Hasidim not to go to Israel if they want to save themselves. They should remember that, right? I mean, in other words, we have to keep that in the back of our minds, so that his refusal to testify, there's something scandalous about his refusal to testify. A holy person to save another human being who was saved by that human being can't bring himself, whatever reason, because of what it would imply regarding Satmar. And the last sort of observation that I would make is that the Satmars were Jewish quietists. That is, they did not dare to impinge upon God's role in Jewish history. They were not actors on the stage of Jewish history, but they were Gentile activists. That is, in the non-Jewish world, there was no problem in being involved in politics, because that was the world of sin anyway. I mean, sort of a cynical, and they did what they had to do, and the guiding principle was their survival, including Rabbi Teitelbaum's survival. Now, Nomi, I noticed the time is 6 o'clock. We did schedule till 6:30. There are a few questions that we'll get to from the audience, but I do want, there are a number of other very important issues. Maybe I should list them. We should talk about the role of women. We have to talk about the introduction of a school district, of an officially recognized public school district, and how that came about, and then the controversy over succession in the community. At least those three subjects. So so people have a more complete picture of what actually transpired. So please illuminate or give us some enlightenment about the role of women. Let me be a little more pointed. I was struck by the fact that the Rabbi Teitelbaum's widow, Alta Fega, was such a powerful personality in the community. How does that happen in Satmar? In fact, the people who opposed the appointment of the following Rebbe, David will tell us about that, they formed a group around her that were called B'nai Yoel, right? They were their own sort of separate group. And then in the book, you talk about the establishment of this school for young children with disabilities, and the role that Malka Silverstein played in establishing that school. So I'm struck. The women who have to basically hide themselves. They can't. One of Yolish's rules is that they must shave their heads, right? And there was what I would call the Satmar stockings. They produced stockings that literally were thick fabric, because no part of the body could be exposed. A temptation surrounds us, and we have to constantly fight against it. So how did it come about that women played this role, and what was the nature of their education? And was the women's education the same as the boys' education? And how did that, what did that produce in terms of their involvement in the job market, right? What jobs did they take, the men and the women? Okay, enough.
Well, first of all, you've asked so many questions that it gives me an opportunity to say the only way that we can answer all of them is you'll have to read the book. So they're wonderful questions, as always. There are many bundled together. So I'm actually going to save the question about the Rebbe's widow for last, and at that point I might hand things over to David. But I think I can answer, and there, you also raised questions about the succession battle. I'm going to save that for later, because I think I can relatively pithily address your questions about the role of women, about the public school district, about the community's response to people, in particular children with disabilities, in sort of one fell swoop, that will also give me an opportunity to return to something you said, where you, in responding to David's description of how when the community is transplanted to America, the art of political negotiation with Gentile authorities that had already been perfected becomes transformed into perfecting the art of interest group politics. And you characterize that as exploitation and kind of greed, and that's all there is. Yeah, that is, and there certainly is something, there's a valid point to make and to consider, and this isn't about the Satmars, it's about American interest group politics. Does that make self-interest the guiding and maybe the only ethos, if it's an ethos at all? Well, maybe, but I would say another word for that is democracy, right? And we're not all that consistent. When do we call a group's self-advocacy selfish, exploitive, indifferent to the interests of others? And when do we see it as like a very legitimate thing to do that is constitutive of democracy? So, I remember years ago, early on when we were doing research, another thing to note is, the Satmars are criticized, as you have done, for being exploitive and selfish and greedy. A lot of the early criticism was focused on their success in gaining all kinds of government benefits. There's so many people on welfare, and they get all these government grants that are targeted for zones of economic opportunity and for low-income people, and which is kind of interesting because those kinds of social welfare programs, right, that represents a strand of American culture that's social welfarist. That's the opposite of a libertarian form of individual self-interest. But so that's one point. I'm linking it to the story of the public school district and the role of women and the treatment of children with disabilities in the following way, because that's a perfect example of how the community came to absorb, or maybe developed in parallel simultaneously through some osmotic fashion, the story of the creation of the public school district is a story that is entirely driven by changing consciousness about people with special needs, about people with disabilities. Before the 1970s, if a child was born with any kind of disability, mental or physical disability, that was actually viewed as sort of some kind of divine punishment on the entire family. It must signify that they had done something to deserve. It was a stigma in every sense, and far from there being sort of services and accommodations for children with special needs and people with disabilities and their families. It was a source of shame, and you would hide someone away. That really began to change, and the change, as you alluded to, was really spurred on, the first people, by women, and one woman in particular, a woman by the name of Malka Silberstein, a very, very formidable person, who is both really kind of was the original kind of proponent of what you might call a disability rights movement inside the Satmar community. And she was still in Brooklyn at the time. A few years later, she moved to Kiryas Joel. And she also, am I right, she was the principal of the girls' school. So, I mean, first of all, that shows that despite the fact that, there's this kind of traditional separate spheres ideology, according to which women can't be leaders, and, people, even the followers of the widow say, well, she wasn't a leader, right? Yeah. But nonetheless, women play very, very important roles, and you might well call them leaders. And so she, also the wife of the man who became the mayor and remains the longtime mayor of the village, she also played an important role in trying to change attitudes and then practices within the community. And that happened virtually at the same time, because it's not as though in the mainstream society, attitudes towards children with disabilities or people were so enlightened. I mean, this is happening at the exact same time that the disability rights movement is taking rise. And that is what leads to the formation of the public school district, because of course, for the most part, the community has zero interest in, they don't want to send their kids to public schools, because in America, public schools have to be secular. So there's, the private school system, the system of religious schools for boys and girls, and yes, they are educated separately, and yes, as I think you were alluding to, girls receive somewhat stronger secular education than boys do. But in the 1970s, one of the very first victories of the broader disability rights movement was the passage of a law making federally and state funded, publicly funded and publicly administered special education services for every child with special needs mandatory. And that created a real conundrum, because did that mean, right, was it possible for these publicly funded, publicly provided special education services to be provided to children in religious schools, in parochial schools? The Supreme Court flip-flopped on that question, and in the period of time in which the Supreme Court seemed to be saying that's impermissible, it's a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which is interpreted to embody a principle of separation of state, it seemed to be the case that the only way these children could receive the special education services to which they were entitled, which indeed were mandatory, was by going to a public school. And that's what led the Satmars to lobby for the passage of a special act that would allow them to have a public school district within the confines of the village.
Yeah, I'll just say a brief word about women and Alta Faiga, and then a little bit about the succession battle. So this is a very traditional community with very traditional division of gender roles, which we should be very clear about. Women, for example, in the community don't drive, whereas men do. Women are expected to adhere to norms of modesty, such that they not be deemed sources of sexual attraction to anyone but their husbands. Women have primary responsibility in the domestic sphere, including raising families that range between 8 and 15 kids. And at the same time, girls are exposed to a different educational diet than that of boys, in sort of ways that grate against that very traditionalist division of labor between the genders. By which I mean, boys are expected to basically consume largely, if not exclusively, a curriculum of traditional Jewish studies, whereas girls are exposed to a diet that is half Jewish studies and half secular studies. One consequence of this is that girls, for the most part, are far better speakers of the English language than boys in the community, who are taught relatively little in English, certainly after bar mitzvah age. And so you have the phenomenon of substantial numbers of boys and men raised in the United States, in Kiryas Joel, who are not fully fluent English speakers, which is not the case for women. So it's important to just sort of lay out some of these important differences. That said, the history of Kiryas Joel features a number of extremely prominent women, the first and most important of whom is the Rebbitzin, the widow of the first Satmar Rebbe, Reb Yoelish, known as Alta Feiga, who after the death of Reb Yoelish became, in fact, the rallying point, and one might say the leader of the first and most important group of dissidents, whom you called the sons of Joel, the B'nai Joel, as they're known in the Hungarian Yiddishized version of Satmar Hebrew. She became the focal point of opposition to Reb Yoelish's successor, his nephew, Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum, known as the Baruch Moshe, who it is said had over the years encouraged his uncle to divorce Alta Feiga before she was Alta, because she did not bear him any children. This apocryphal tale may have been the source of the deep enmity between Alta Feiga and the Baruch Moshe. Whatever the case may be, they didn't like each other, we know that. And she continued to be a formidable force into the early 2000s before she died. Meanwhile, that original group of dissidents would go on to become one of the principal sources of opposition to the leadership of Reb Moshe, but then significantly, so Reb Moshe assumes the title of Satmar Rav in 1979 and Satmar Rebbe in 1980, rules for 20 years, and then in 1999 makes a shocking decision when he essentially decides to divide the global Satmar Empire into two. Everybody assumed that he would make his eldest son, Reb Aaron Teitelbaum, who was appointed rabbi of Kiryas Joel in 1984, the heir apparent and the heir of the entire empire, with hundreds of millions of dollars of real estate holdings and moistus, as they're known, institutions the world over. Instead, he offered Reb Aaron the choice between Kiryas Joel and Williamsburg. And his third son, Zalman Leib, after Aaron was stunned by this news, was brought in to basically take over Williamsburg, at which point the empire was divided into Kiryas Joel and Williamsburg. And the succession battle went into its second phase, the first being the controversy of the existence of a group of dissidents opposing Reb Moshe, and then the second phase, the division of the empire into followers of the two sons, Aaron and Zalman Leib. And to this day, we now have three groups, as it were, the Zalis, the Aronis, and the B'nai Joel, each of which has its own moistus, its own school, ritual baths, wedding halls,
Synagogues.
Pardon me?
Synagogues.
And shuls.
Yeshivas.
Yeah. And what's so interesting is that in the early, what the existence of these three strands represents is the turning inward of that combative spirit so emblematic of the Teitelbaum family line, which had been directed outward principally at other Jews, other Satmar other non-Satmar Jews. But then we see a kind of turning inward of that combative sensibility with the loss of the towering founder of the dynasty, Rabbi Chaim. There were instances of vilification of the other, of libel of the other, of physical violence amongst the various strands. And yet a very significant turning point came when one of the longstanding officials of the community said, you know what, it turns out we fought, we bickered, we beat each other, we sued each other. Maybe competition isn't so bad, right? Maybe competition is actually good for business. Allows for the growth, the strengthening, the sharpening of each of these lines. And that's sort of where we're at, where you have three distinct groups within Kiryas Joel, as well as Williamsburg, not necessarily dwelling, in loving harmony, but certainly with a modus vivendi that makes the flourishing of each of them possible according to the terms of success that they set out.
Okay, so we have about a little less than 15 minutes, and before we conclude, I do want to respond to some points that were made in the chat. Yes, indeed, Elie Wiesel came from Sighet. That's correct.
Yep.
And if you travel there today, as we did, you can visit the museum in Elie Wiesel's house. You get the person who asked about liberation from Belgium. Well, you did get that story of how that fit into that whole the Kastner scheme. And someone asked Nomi, how did they convince the people of Monroe and the state of New York to grant them their own zoning? What was the negotiation? If somehow you could combine that, I was thinking, David, as you were describing the competition, that sort of runs together with a notion that's promoted in the book that Satmar was riding the current of multiculturalism in America, and that the change in America, in a sense of American self-understanding, from the common good to difference as being the guiding principle, was actually something that the Satmars were able to exploit for their own benefit. But they manifest difference themselves. They're not satisfied with simply being the different group in America. They have all the difference in their own community. And David, maybe you could say some words as we near the close about the dissenters in the community. Are there free thinkers? What's the level of retention? I mean, there's some aspect of this. And where do you go? Where do you go if you leave? So how do you leave? What opportunities present themselves? And Nomi, as you're talking about Americanization, I think, and this is a point that you make very strongly, what happened politically among Satmar between 2016 and 2020? 2016, 55% of the community voted for Trump. And in 2020, 99%, an incredible number when you think about it. And since they're an isolated political enclave, we then have accurate figures about their voting patterns. So what's going on?
Yeah.
Please.
Okay. Well, I'll start with the first question. It is such a great question. How did they persuade the townspeople of Monroe and the authorities to grant them a government? I love that question because it gives me the opportunity to make one of our main points. There's if you just look in sort of the broad course of human history and compare America to other countries today and to how societies operated in the past, we can draw a distinction between two very different models of what we might call multiculturalism or communitarianism, or any society in which there are many different subgroups. How does a subgroup get to have its own local government or its own enclave, private or public? Well, historically, the dominant, or maybe the only way that could happen was from the top down, just as that question sort of presupposes. You have to get the authorities to grant you the right, or more technically, the privilege of forming and having and running your own local government. And that's how, that's how it was done in the old, that's still how, so, governments would give those sub-communities they recognize. So all of this is dependent on getting the recognition of the powers that be. If you're not recognized and favored by the government as the question, then you're out of luck. But those that were recognized and protected would be literally granted a charter which gave them land. The government would say, you get to live here, and certain, and jurisdiction, limited jurisdiction, powers of government. We don't do that in the United States. So the simple answer to the question of how did they persuade, they didn't have to. So how did it come about? Well, I'll return to my earlier theme. It's called democracy. It's called local democracy. In the United States of America and in our federated system, every state has laws that allow people who live in a certain area to basically use the right to vote. If a majority of residents in a certain area, and every state has different rules. So in New York State, the rules actually make it super easy for populations in outside of the city to, if a majority of them want to form their own village within a town that they live, all they have to do is get enough signatures on a petition to put it to a ballot, and it's a majority vote. So democracy. Now, of course, before democracy comes private property, right? So this is what makes it a liberal, right? So how did it happen? Well, first they exercised the right of private property and they bought land and they developed and settled it. And then they exercised their right to vote. And that's how it happened.
Yeah, I can get a little bit more specific. On October 26, 1976, there was scheduled to be opened in Brooklyn a religious discrimination suit brought by Satmar Hasidim against residents and officials of the town of Monroe for interfering into the free exercise of their religion through zoning regulations. On Motzei Shabbos, October 23rd, 1976, facing the specter of this lawsuit, town officials and Satmar officials, mediated by a very interesting lawyer who was not a town official, brokered a deal by which it was agreed that there would be a carve-out for a new village of Kiryas Joel. I want to just address Carol Scott's question in a private chat to me. The village of Kiryas Joel existed and continues to exist, but in 2019, after really decades of ongoing strife between the village of Kiryas Joel and the town of Monroe, in which it was nested, the two parties again agreed to a fuller form of divorce, to the removal of Kiryas Joel from the town of Monroe, and the creation of a new town. It's a very rare event in the history of the state of New York, to be called Palm Tree, the English translation of the name Teitelbaum. And so we have now the town of Palm Tree, which is completely coterminous with the village of Kiryas Joel, but has its own governmental apparatus that is essentially identical to that of Kiryas Joel. All right. I want to just address very quickly a couple of the questions you asked.
One, signed into and approved by Andrew Cuomo.
Signed into law by Andrew Cuomo, sort of bookending the decision, the signature of his father to create the village of Kiryas Joel. You asked about dissidents and free thinkers. So we've been talking about dissidents who are the opposite of free thinkers. They are the most stringent followers of Rabbi Yoelish and believe that the mainstream has in some sense deviated from the path of Rabbi Yoelish, even though in terms of ritual observance, there's no discernible difference. However, there is in Kiryas Joel also another group of dissidents, some of whom find life in the community not the most beautiful form of existence imaginable, as many people in Kiryas Joel told me they believe their Shtetl is, but regard it as a suffocating existence that they cannot tolerate. and they exit the community. And we also spoke to people who exit the community. And what we want to say is our job is not to affirm the validity of their view, or for that matter, that of those who remain within. We say we come neither to condemn nor condone. We want to sort of understand this community. And both of those positions are represented within it. That is, it's suffocating and it's too oppressive and authoritarian. And it's the most beautiful form of, the most holistic, organic, beautiful form of existence imaginable, right? I also discovered in the course of just spending time there, another form of dissonance, sort of the pot smoking, guitar strumming, Breslov Hasidic contingent within the community, who kind of roll their eyes at the rabbis. They're people who manifest what we call a process of unwitting assimilation that we think has been a very important feature in the history and success of the community. They're people who spend a lot of their time in violation of longstanding prohibitions and taboos online. They sort of live a world, an internal world outside of the community, even though they remain fully within, and you would not be able to identify them in any way, shape, or form as dissidents. So that's a really interesting small constituency within the community. The final question I want to address is what we saw in the transition from 2016 to 2020 in terms of political behavior. Something really shocking happened. Somewhere between 52 to 55%. There are competing numbers in 2016 because we don't yet have the town of Palm Tree, which allows us more precise data, voted for Donald Trump. In 2020, 99% of the community voted for Donald Trump. What happened? Well, it would seem that the process of unwitting assimilation continued, and in terms of sort of public and visible self-presentation, Satmar Hasidim came really to resemble the behavior and attitudes of white religious conservatives.
Christian
Christian
conservatives.
conservatives.
Around the issues of religious liberty, COVID restrictions.
Right. And this is something that seems very, very striking. It entails, it would seem on the surface, the abandonment of a long-standing transactional pragmatism in politics and its replacement by a very classically ideological conservatism that we notice in white Christian conservatives. There are other factors that may have entered into that dramatic shift. I'm not sure we have time to discuss them. What I will say is I'm continuing to do research on this very fascinating, dramatic shift in political behavior, and we'll see what we come up with in the coming years. My suspicion is that there'll continue to be that pragmatic transactional politics at the local level. Whether we see the fortification of that ideological conservatism at the national level is an open question.
So unfortunately, we've reached the end of our hour and a half, and
We just started, Chaim.
It's been fascinating, and we've covered a lot. We've covered a lot. I would say that something that hit me was that many of these dissidents that you talked about, the pot smoking, as well as the free thinkers, have chosen to remain in Kiryas Joel, right? Sort of an underground in Kiryas Joel, and they stay there. It seems to me for some of the same reasons that you're attracted to Kiryas Joel. There's something about this very strange place, an amalgam of Jewish extremists, that is attractive. There's a community, there's warmth. There are people who really care about one another. I mean, they're not the politicians necessarily, right? But they give to one another. The depth of chesed, of loving kindness extended from one person to the other is something remarkable. So I think those dissidents don't want to give that up. So they're willing to live with dissonance. And you're not only willing, you're immersed and pursuing further research about this place. So I want to thank you for participating today. for writing a fascinating and excellent account of an American Jewish anomaly, or is it really as American as apple pie? Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. Looking forward to seeing you in a few weeks with Art Green, on God. What is the title? God, Love, and Introspection. A spiritual adventure with probably the most important spiritual teacher in America, Jewish spiritual teacher in America today. Thank you, and thank you, Giselle, for the remarkable way in which you engineer these events and make them possible. And thank you, Hillel, for sponsoring our intellectual adventures. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Shalom, shalom.